Colleagues and friends, what a pleasure to join you here for this short teaser session, which was originally intended for the HR World Congress 2022. And again, I want to make a short call out for all those friends who participated, like Dave Ulrich and Linda Grattan and John Lurie. Please have a look at their sessions as well, as I'm sure there's lots and lots to be inspired by and learn. What I will try to do in the next 20 minutes or so is to reflect together with you on leadership for humanity, and especially on three questions that have kept me awake and pondering during the last decades. Why is it that we seem to be failing to transform our businesses for more humanity? And what does this sustained human capability, which is the theme of this conference today, mean in the first place? How should that more humane work of the future actually look like? And of course, what type of leadership is then required to get us there? And I will try to spark your thoughts with a few hopefully provocative ideas. And I've selected also some more complex slides from our ongoing work, but they are intended mainly as a token for you to consider in your own time in case you're interested. But first and foremost, who is we? I will be speaking today on behalf of Antoinette Weibel and her PhD team at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland, as well as myself. And Antoinette, for those who don't know her, is a senior professor of management and one of the most outspoken voices in HR in Europe. Whilst I have been in leadership positions for all my career, last as ING's Chief Operating and Transformation Officer. And together, Antoinette and I, bridging research and practice, we decided about 18 months ago to embark on an inquiry to ask some of these tough questions with the intention to find out how in the 21st century we can inspire organizations to become good and contribute to human flourishing. And did I mention there are no easy answers? Indeed, I believe this is probably one of the most serious problems we are facing today. Our analysis is often very shallow. And this is how the story typically goes. Someone somewhere lifts the business on a virtual kind of operating table and starts to pull out its various components. And when we start to look at the business bowels, so to speak, the inputs, the production process, the outputs, it quickly turns out not to be very pretty. Some companies treat their employees literally as disposable resources. Others exploit natural resources recklessly and without regard for the future generations. And when it comes to production, some continue with Taylorist torture or employ bosses who do not seem to have any moral standard at all or any basic decency. And in terms of products, some create harm and even lie about it, or others are simply parasites who do not produce anything and just try to produce more money. And at this point, we all pretend to look really shocked. But if we are honest, we aren't, and I come back to that later. But we most solemnly decide that something must be done. And you already know how the story continues. We all meet at conferences like this one, or Davos, or the Drucker Forum, and we declare that capitalism has ended. Capitalism has become a bad word. And then economists shout that we need to price externalities into the market because the market is going to fix it. Politicians run behind the economists and shout even louder and call in meetings. Close up next are technologists who declare that innovation is going to fix everything. Activists don't buy any of it and want new laws and regulation and donut economics. And of course, in the heat of all of this, businesses very earnestly get roundtables together and promise to be better. And then greenwashing and purpose washing abound. And what happens next? Well, as usual, the consultants come along, promising visionary transformations with high performance and agility and efficiency, all the usual suspects. And frankly, many of us are not much better. We come in with new theories and tools and solutions. And then who would have ever thought nothing ever changes? So why are so many undoubtedly clever people failing? Why is all this actionism and all these SDGs and ESGs and CSRs and GDPs and whatever three-letter acronyms never making the sky any brighter? We believe it is because we have become what Mats Alvesen calls functionally stupid. We have stopped asking the right questions. The problem simply is not analytical. We cannot read the solution from the bowels of business. We must go back instead to what the point of all that business was in the first place. And if you're like me, you might find this story of the ideology of work during history quite amusing. 2,500 years ago, no decent citizen would have ever engaged in all this business, that busyness that we have today. Contemplation was indeed the name of the game. Only when some monastic movements in the Middle Ages suggested that work could go with prayer, it became proper, ora et labora. And only with Calvinism did work transmute into vocation that could actually help us to get saved and go to paradise. And then it all went very quickly. Suddenly, idleness was sin, job was all that mattered. And before we knew it, work became life. And when last century elapsed, eventually, even those jobs as such became irrelevant. Wealth, the money our jobs make, today is all that matters. And hence, you might have already suspected it, at the end, the real story is not about better action, it's about better value. Because with the Enlightenment, we might have defied religious dogma, but we very quickly substituted it by reifying materialism and then create a cult of the individual. From a kingdom of ends, we landed with an aristocracy of means. And this had consequences. Not only did our society friction, as Robert Putnam so nicely shows, but also as Karl Polanyi brilliantly stated in his Great Transformation, we invented not only instrumental rationalism, but also fictitious commodities. Human life suddenly became labor. Relational community and assistance became financial exchange and money, and nature turned into land and property. And man proudly declared that all the world was up for sale. Well, of course, only as long as there's profit to be made, because that is our great legitimizer, isn't it? By glorifying utility, efficiency, and profit, we turn the question of what is good, what is beauty, what is human, into a question of return on equity. As long as we create a little more benefit than cost, we're good to go. And no surprise, hence, that our companies moved at lightning speed from being collective endeavors in the interest of the public to the casino capitalism for the sake of the few that we have today. And in the end, as Ernest Hemingway once declared, in the end, the age was handed the kind of shit that it demanded. Once we declared that rational living is a cost-benefit equation, life became very hollow, a bank account, consumption, a selfie on some social media sites. Our society became an aristocracy of wealth and self-interested consumerism. And the funny thing is that we even suggested that people who would not follow this utilitarian folly and resisted becoming that dystopian economic man, that homo economicus, were irrational, not realizing that nothing about this utilitarian instrumental rationality is rational in the first place. And I think this leads us to a very important insight. This invisible hand indeed exists, only it's not the market, it's the way we think. All those behaviors that we looked at on that imagined operating table are mostly the necessary consequences of our flawed way of thinking, because our logic underpins almost everything, our relational and political, institutional, and economic models. So we need to take a step back and again start from the real question, which is, why should we really get up every morning and go to work? What is that real value of investing on average almost 100,000 hours of our life in the office? And here I think we might be able to learn a little bit from the last or past 2,500 years of moral philosophy. And that frankly was a difficult labor to talk to many philosophers and try to understand what has been going on in the kind of science of life. Philosophy, they say, is a love affair with questions, and sometimes not so easy to get to the bottom of it. But do you remember Plato's cave, the allegory of the cave? There, Plato suggested that we are seduced by those mere shadows of what makes life good. putting those material goods above the true forms and essences of universal good and beauty. And hence, in order to ascend from the cave to lead a good life, we needed to learn to discern those ideals from the shadows around us and get out. And I think that somehow sounds familiar. Indeed, today it sometimes feels that we are sitting back in that cave. Not only is our logic very focused on material goods, but we also have lots of ideas floating around that we do not quite know how to examine, right? And this is when diversity becomes problematic, because when we start to glorify every idea or fad as if it was truth in its own right, without a proper dialectic to scrutinize what good these ideas stand for. So I could add a few more sparkling concepts today and add to that word cloud that you see on the right, but frankly, it would make no difference. Nobody knows what good is anymore, and everybody is afraid to make a wrong move. But the point is, as leaders, we need to take a justified stand for a future, for a type of social order, for a type of morality. Otherwise, frankly, we're not leading anywhere. So we're in the middle of building a moral development model. And I cannot go into details, but based on our research, moral reasoning always requires the contemporary evaluation of actions based on both the relational caring for specific others as human beings, and on the cognitive perspective taking as a member of a societal order based on its values in relation to some overarching whole. We simply cannot avoid either of those claims, and to simply ignore them, frankly, is not intelligence or entrepreneurial fail-fast cleverness, but bigotry. And on this basis, we can start to slowly identify some frames and kind of schemes that can support us in the development of increasing capacity in our moral reasoning. Because we quickly realize that every set of ideas we encounter needs to be evaluated from that greater, more complex, holistic perspective. Better understanding requires higher complexity of thought. And here we can also see very quickly that the moral philosophy after the Enlightenment, apart from having lots of inconsistencies in each of the theories, has taken some shortcuts by kind of slicing and dicing the requirement for moral wholeness into kind of analytical pieces. But that simply is not how moral living works. And here we can also see there's really nothing like a value-neutral science. Every theory implies some moral positioning. And in fact, by making reasoning instrumental and highly simplistic over the last 5 decades, rather than ascending from the cave, we have proudly decorated it. And here I want to come to the inventor of virtue ethics, Aristotle. And Aristotle concurs with Plato that the good is to be found behind those shadows. But he revolutionizes the thinking about the good life in 2 ways. Firstly, he suggests that those essential goods are not outside ourselves as eternal forms, but inside. Every single person carries the potential for good inside their soul as a part of a shared spirit of human possibility. And secondly, not only does this good exist inside us, but we're naturally pulled towards this. We might be driven by needs and wants, but we are also pulled towards a telos, as he called it, a desire to become our best self inside some greater whole. So we can flourish if only we're able to bring wisdom to those emotions and actions that we have. But of course, that isn't easy, because it requires us first and foremost to develop an understanding of the moral space and all those ideas that we saw earlier, and to position ourselves inside that space. And that means we need to become aware and able to evaluate not only those values and ideas floating around in our community of reference, but also of our psychological wants and desires and patterns in order to critically examine them and enact our possible best self. And that is the development of moral identity and what Aristotle called practical wisdom. Rather than a cost-benefit analysis, phronesis, as he called it, is our executive ability to explore complex situations from all perspectives, understanding what goods are at stake, and then enacting our situational best action to move closer to our best self and the goods it and we represent. And here again, I think people are often not quite getting this right. This is not about more participation, diversity, or democracy, or self-management, unbossing, or wisdom of the crowds. No, none of these is a guarantor for good action and true inspiration. It's about excellence, about making good, abductive judgments in presence of uncertainty, whilst, or in order to actualize our highest human potential. And here I think Aristotle might have been a frequent speaker at seminars like ours. And over time, he probably realized that talk is quite cheap, where becoming is about action. And arguably not every decision is a complex reasoning process, or can be. So we need some heuristics, some bridges, some tools to enact the right attitude that will help us to become better. And these are the so-called virtues. These are not values, and these are also not some manipulative methods, but habitual ways to enact the good that we are called to bring forth in ourselves, in our lives. But I think beyond any details, what matters most is this. Virtue ethics enables a compelling new story. Aristotle offers a highly hopeful vision of human beings as ends, not means. For Aristotle, every human being can inspire their own lives through their roles in society and actualize their own unique potential. That is at the same time a constituent part of the common human good. And external goods like status or money and those selfies are relevant only insofar as they enable what really matters, which is becoming our best self. A wise man, therefore, would never ask for more of them than they require in order to flourish. And I mean man and woman. And Aristotle also immediately points out here the importance of community. And again, not as a question of deontic principles of dignity or human rights or a Catholic requirement for solidarity. No, because we all carry those parts of the essential human spirit. We all constitute that common human good. So we are not just actively listening to one another as some technique, but we're actively seeking to recognize and embrace that part of the good that is in each other, in which we can emulate then in our own lives. So competition is also not stupidly positional to beat someone else, but a collaborative challenge for personal excellences and to discover the true possibilities of humanity. And I think this is a completely different story from where we started, and one that I believe is much more hopeful for humanity. A story that suddenly turns work and action into self-actualization and flourishing rather than utility or exploitation or suffering. But it does require significant change. What does this mean for our organization? Well, it means we need to build organizations that enable people to flourish. We need to therefore build on the task and production systems, but not just by simply adding a few sustainability projects or ethics codes, but by revising how our jobs and tasks can enable those unique life stories. And it also means crafting and protecting virtuous communities that can enable not only professional, but personal development, and that support organizational flourishing through relationships, development, and contribution. And this brings us to the concept of a good organization. A good organization is deliberately developmental and seeks three things. Firstly, meaningful work for the individual as an end in itself. Secondly, the furthering of a just, sustainable, good society that enables the flourishing of all. And thirdly, the establishment of those mutual communities of purpose that are constitutive of and enable the development of excellence, or simply, as Linda Grattan probably calls it, virtuous friendships at work. So that business, as it was intended in that original vision, the very first vision ever of a civic economy, suggested already 10 years before Adam Smith by Antonio Genovese, might once again become a renaissance of inspiration and a positive constitutive force of a good society premised on the sacred spirit and the best of humanity. Businesses that, yes, achieve viability, but always as a secondary condition. We make profits as a means to enable our good lives and flourishing in community, not an end in itself. And what does all of this, before I go anywhere else, I should spend a word on complexity, because I think this is also where a lot of the complexity science and this notion of complex adaptive system goes all right. It's not really helpful. In my experience, a lot of the complexity that we're facing in our individual lives, but especially in business, is complexity that derives from people, from human problems, from the fact that we have many, many different opinions and we cannot agree what value is. And I'm building on the Ralph Stacey matrix here. And when at the same time, uncertainty in the form of interdependence becomes ever greater, it's very easy to see that a logical reasoning and the societal institutions based on markets where everybody's seeking their own benefit, but without an understanding or commitment to the whole, will ultimately lead us to chaos, will lead us to the destruction of what we actually care for. And by the same token, the call for more rules and laws cannot be effective because we know from many studies that the compliance drive, the ticking the boxes, the laws very often are not applicable to the circumstances that we face, and secondly, directly influence and crowd out the very predisposition of an actor to behave ethically. We end up just doing what is necessary to stay out of jail. And here, I want to get to what does this mean for leadership, right? The main point I think that all of this leads to is the fact that we cannot build a good society without good citizens, and we cannot build good organizations without good leaders. And transformation is easily understandable in the context of good organization becomes not simply about more efficiency or more agility in adapting a company to the changes in the environment, but also about the enablement of collective wisdom through organizational institutions so that not only individuals are developing through their work, but that we all collectively make truly inspired decisions and judgments about where to take our organizations and why, accepting a grown-up responsibility for all stakeholders and the common good. And no surprise that this requires more mature leaders. We can never take someone where we haven't been ourselves. And we call this the first law of transformation. The maturity of an organizational system can never transcend the maturity of the people in charge. But secondly, and equally important, the development of such leaders is not just about emotional intelligence or leadership styles or coaching skills, being nice to people in home office. No, it needs to reflect progress in practical wisdom with character at its foundation. Good leaders indeed need to be good people in service of good. And in order to be effective then, they must systematically attain those skills and competencies required to enable and channel the energy and creativity of all their organizational citizens, and to continuously evolve the identity and value system of such good organizations in order to materialize, to become their very best in service of humanity as a whole. And by the way, the last thing we need is narcissistic fools who think they know better than everybody else in positions of great power. Because without wisdom in today's world, leaders will wreak great havoc. And in this context, leadership, ultimately, rather than being a set of skills or traits or separate elites, is about activating a generative and institutional process that elevates the whole system to a higher level of energy. Leadership is the capacity of a community or society to create its future. That's why we strongly believe leadership must be framed as a profession of lifelong learning, not as a leadership seminar, a mindfulness course, or a training bootcamp. But you might say that's utopia. Well, I'm very proud to announce today publicly that we have just agreed with Robert Bosch Group, a company with 400,000 employees, 78 billion annual sales revenue, 440 subsidiaries in 60 countries, to launch our very first good organization experimentation lab, or G-Lab, next year. And of course, we're very happy to speak to others, considering that everything we do is strictly pro bono for the good of all. But we are in an HR conference. So where does all of this leave HR? That's my final reflection. I think we certainly must revise what it means to develop human excellence. We need to ensure people have access as well as the tools and the support to develop wisdom and virtues in community and flourish. And especially we must professionalize leadership development, as just said. If I could only have one wish today, it is stop the bad leaders. Not only people who are blatantly misbehaving and carrying sinks around your offices, but also those who have not yet reached the level of wisdom required to responsibly lead themselves and others. Stop them, and therefore help all of us. But I think, taking a step back, there's another final suggestion I want to make. I think HR is and has always been in a pole position. That means HR can be and should be a driving force for good, but it can also quickly become a henchman of history and simply perpetuate the functional stupidity of that church of capitalism. And sometimes I must admit, I'm quite surprised about how little self-awareness and self-criticism I find in the HR community at conferences like this. And I want to say this with brotherly love, so to speak. So I would suggest that HR probably needs to work hard to develop its own wisdom, to understand what goods they own, they can bring out, and to act with virtues and courage to help organizations to become better. And sometimes I think you might need to dare to glue yourselves to those boardroom tables like those climate activists in the museums and insist that we revise how to develop individuals and organizational character, reframe organizational design in that spirit of wisdom, and remove finally some of those anachronistic non-working HR processes in order to shift from performance management to excellence. In a nutshell, HR friends, we need you on board. Which brings me really to the end. If any of this is interesting, you're very heartily invited to learn more about our inquiry on the web or to join some of the HR focus group sessions that we are just sketching out. Just connect with me or Antoinette on LinkedIn. And of course, you can find also on our website some of the interviews with highly inspirational global thought leaders for humanity, all those transformation professionals who are like us, seeking to bring out the good in the organizations they touch. And as usual, whatever you do next, please never forget, we're not leaders because we rule. We are leaders because we truly care. Thank you very much indeed.